Okay, folks, last we left off, it was Leonardo da Vinci, and now we're going to move into the artwork of Raphael in chapter 22. And with Raphael, he was called upon by the Pope, and his art was it began in Rome, and it was surpassing all others whenever it came to... Oh wait, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. With his art in the beginning, it was a time when Rome was starting to surpass all others in comparison to the patronage during the Renaissance at the time. So, as I mentioned, there were lots of merchants and mercantile classes and the maritime traders that were really big in trade and commerce and banking, that made them big patrons in the arts and allowed for many wonderful commissions, i.e. with Leonardo da Vinci and others that preceded him, like Masaccio and such. And with Raphael, it was at a time when Rome started to become, with the Papal States, with Catholicism, as the lead patron of the fine arts at this time. So Raphael was the first to be called upon as a lead artist for the Papal States and for Rome. So with that, he actually was the first to develop a personal style to show what will be known as the High Renaissance. So this is going to be a time period just prior to the High Renaissance, but Raphael is going to be the first to really show that attention to a High Renaissance style. And he also is a successor to, in a way, Leonardo da Vinci, and he learned through emulation and that imitation that we talked about in the last chapter through Leonardo da Vinci, but indirectly, not directly. He didn't study directly with Leonardo, but he did learn through Leonardo's paintings how to design a certain type of style. And we can see that with the first piece, Madonna in the Meadow, and that's figure 22.8. And with this, you can see that he adopted Leonardo's pyramidal composition and that mathematical design that Leonardo used in Madonna of the Rocks. But here you can see there's the pyramidal scale and the pyramidal formulae that's being used, but there's no angel involved, and it's directed in the opposite force of visual energy. So what I mean by that is, with Madonna of the Rocks, the pyramidal scale was moving down to the bottom right. And in this case, with figure 22.8, Madonna in the Meadow, the configuration is moving down to the bottom part of the left. And there's three components: John the Baptist, Jesus, and the Madonna, which is Mary. But with Madonna of the Rocks, with Leonardo, there were four. The angel was involved. So Raphael is using three vertices to give a sense of pyramidal composition and pyramidal scale. All right. But one thing you should also notice is that there's not a heavy use of chiaroscuro with Raphael. It's much lighter, and the meadow is very true to the origins of where Raphael is coming from. Okay, those lighter tones are very true to a Milan-like style. All right, so his upbringing is very derivative, or his upbringing, the style and the lightness that you see in this painting is derivative of his background, his personal heritage, the background, the painters that he followed other than Leonardo. And you can see that there's more of a lightness in the hues and the tones of the color, and not so much of a heavy darkness like we saw with the chiaroscuro and sfumato with Leonardo da Vinci, with Madonna in the rocks. And here, with Madonna in the meadow, it's very different, but it's very similar as well. So again, be able to compare and contrast Raphael's Madonna in the meadow with Leonardo's Madonna in the rocks. So, Raphael, he learned how to use this pyramidal composition when he was in Florence. And he learned because Leonardo ended up finding his way to Florence. He started in Milan, which is where Raphael is. But Raphael, he traveled to Florence when Leonardo was in Florence and learned techniques that Leonardo did when he was in Milan. So it's kind of like this full circle kind of indirect education, if you will. One thing about Raphael's Madonna in the Meadow versus Leonardo's Madonna in the Rocks is that, as I mentioned already, it's a very light and subtle chiaroscuro. Okay? A very light and subtle chiaroscuro. And with the feathery trees and the meadow background is more of him. It's more of his style, because that is something that is very similar to the birthplace in which Raphael came from versus Leonardo. Okay, so that's why you have that lightness. And he used the lighter tones versus Leonardo. But do know that both Raphael's Madonna in the Meadow as well as Leonardo's Madonna in the Rocks will influence all the next generation of painters that we'll see. For example, in the Manneristic and in the Manneristic styles of Titian, as well as the influence of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel will be directly influenced by Raphael's paintings, and Raphael's paintings were influenced by Leonardo's paintings. Okay, so it just becomes this sequential successor and predecessor like level of influence. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And now, from figure 22.8, we're going to move to figure 22.9, and we're going to look at Philosophy, School of Athens by Raphael. And this painting was done, first of all, it's a fresco, and it's a buen fresco, so B-U-E-N fresco, F-R-E-S-C-O, which means that the painting was done when the plaster was still wet. So the plaster was laid on the wall, and within certain sections at about, let's say, 4 feet by 4 feet, section of plaster was placed on the wall, which sticks to the wall, smoothed out. As it's starting to dry, then the oil and tempera pigment paint is painted on the surface of the plaster. Then what will happen is that section of plaster will start to dry and create a crystalline calcium structure on the surface and interface with the pigments of the oil and tempera to create an luminous protective shell of all the intricate painting that was done. Then as that's drying, then another 4 foot by 4 foot section is being painted, and then he does the same thing and then moves on to the next. And then ultimately this painting is 19 feet by 27 feet. So 19 feet tall by 27 feet wide. Okay, so it's called Philosophy, School of Athens. And where it was painted is in the Pope's library, where the papal documents were signed. So anything that was done in Rome and needed to be signed by the Pope and his papal entourage and all the individuals that are there to speak and represent on his behalf, this is where the documents were signed. Now, why that's important is because it has very important Greek and Roman elements to this painting. The Greek is the element of rationalism found in the figure of Aristotle and Plato in the center of the composition, in the archway. Okay, in that barrel vault archway that we see, that is highlighting the main figures. And Aristotle is to the right and Plato is to the left, and both of them represent logic and drama. So with Aristotle to the right comes logic, and on the left is Plato, which comes the drama. And Plato was the main writer of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which was very important during the Hellenistic period with Alexander the Great. And what this is doing and depicting is showing that the Pope's love for being spiritual and temporal, so being spiritual and secular, so showing divinity and the importance of God, but also the importance of man being rational in nature. That's why Plato and Aristotle are side by side. And Aristotle is pointing to the Plato to the left is pointing to the heavens, which is the dramatic exposure of divinity. Okay? And Aristotle to the right in the blue is pointing down, or placing his head down to the earth, so the earthly realm. And it's showing the significance of the importance of religiosity as well as mathematics and science and art in particular. So Plato is the divinity and the spirituality, and Aristotle is that of the earthly activities of new sciences as well as new arts. Okay, so it's a very philosophical and religious formula, so to speak, mathematical equation. So scientists and philosophies are coming from this antiquity. All right, the books in which they hold, both Plato and Aristotle, are elements of philosophy and religious philosophy at that, and that of new sciences, which is that of Aristotle. Those books that they're carrying. Another thing that's really important is the ancient Roman aspect that we see here. So we're talking about the Greek aspect with the two main figures in the center, which is creating the vanishing point, by the way. So all of the architecture, except for one thing, is moving in parallel back to that archway right above Aristotle and Plato. Okay, so there's the vanishing point, and there's the linear perspective that Raphael is using. But there's a two-point perspective that's present in this painting, and that is where the individual is hanging on top of a cube in the center bottom left, and that is moving back towards the left. So when you see one element in the composition where the angles are moving in an opposite direction to where all the other structural angles are moving, that's called a two-point perspective. And that's what Raphael is developing his own style based off of what's called a two-point perspective. So the first point is everything leading back to that barrel archway vault behind Aristotle and Plato. And then the figure, which we believe may be Michelangelo, with his elbow on the cube and his fist on his face, is the second point perspective, and it's moving away from the central vanishing point. off to another illusionary vanishing point. And we believe it has something to do with the ties of the sculptural figures that are back on the wall, all right, in the niche, giving play to Michelangelo and his sculptural brilliance. So that perspective, that second vanishing point, is moving back to the far left where one of the sculptural figures is being designed. Okay? Almost like a segue into Michelangelo's brilliance, so to speak. But the architecture itself is a barrel vault system that is an old basilica style that the Romans originated and used the concrete to create these kind of barrel vault systems. And so that is what makes it Greco-Roman, is you have a combination of the Greek, Aristotle and Plato, and then you have the use of the barrel vault system, which makes it very Roman. And that kind of barrel vault system that we see here is called a Coffer Vault. C-O-F-F-E-R, Coffer Vault. And it's very much like the Basilica Nova that Constantine, at the very end of the Roman Empire, used in the Basilica Nova when he shifted the attention of polytheism, or the belief of multiple gods, to the belief of one singular God. Okay, and Constantine is the one who developed that concept in Italy and embraced the idea of one singular God versus the belief of multiple gods. And this painting by Raphael in the School of Athens is reflecting that interest in that basilica style. A few other things that I kind of mentioned was Plato points to heaven and Aristotle is at the earth. He's placing his hand down to the earth, which again is that rationalism and spirituality hand in hand. Mathematicians are in the audience everywhere throughout this whole composition. There's clusterings of different mathematicians throughout the imagery of the School of Athens, which is an emphasis on the new sciences, which is very important to this time during the Renaissance. Raphael is in the black hat to the right, so the artist is portraying himself in the painting. So if you look at it, you zoom in, you go all the way to the right at the bottom, he is in the black hat, which is something that the Northern European painters did as well, and Velázquez will do during the Baroque period in Spain in particular, and starting to include themselves in the paintings, kind of like very quietly, subtly signing who they are as the painter. It is a fresco. I already talked about that. It's a blend fresco, primary fresco, so it's been painted while the plaster's wet. The vanishing point is at Plato's head, right behind, when Plato is the one in the red in the middle, to the left, with the two main figures in the center. And diagonal and clusters of peace. So with mathematics comes a sense of peace and rationality and calm and serenity, which is ultimately kind of an organic geometry, so to speak, or a sacred geometry, so to speak, which is being placed and controlled throughout the overall composition, giving it a sense of peace. Even though it feels clustered, there is a peacefulness about the grouping of the figures, and that is intentional through the diagonals of the bodies. Like you see with the figure in the center on the right on the stairs, it's a main mathematician that is moving his body in a diagonal way towards Aristotle and Plato, and that is an intentional use of using figures as equational variables within the overall composition, which is very important during the Renaissance. But do know that the overall focus is on Christianity. Okay, so the overall focus is on Christianity, and it's combining this interest in rationality, mathematics, and sciences, and equating it to the importance of the biblical narrative. Okay, so that's ultimately the goal that Raphael is trying to portray. Alright, I'll leave you at that with Raphael. In the next video we'll move into Michelangelo.